A river in Alaska just broke its own record. Not from rain, not from snowmelt, from a wall of ice above the city that gave way without warning, releasing an entire lake in hours. The water didn't rise. It exploded. The federal government declared a major disaster. The only thing that stopped the city from going underwater was a set of temporary flood barriers that engineers had installed just weeks before, not as a permanent solution, but to buy time. Time for what exactly? Nobody has answered that yet. This is not an isolated event. This is a preview. And according to a study just published in one of the most respected scientific journals on Earth, the preview is about to become the main event in Alaska, in the Pacific Northwest, and in every glaciated mountain region that drains toward a populated valley. The study analyzed more than 3,100 glaciers around the world. Not the slow-retreating kind, the surging kind. A surging glacier is not simply a melting one. It is a glacier that periodically accelerates, moving 10 to 100 times faster than normal, advancing suddenly and violently rather than retreating quietly. While most glaciers are pulling back as the planet warms, these 3,100 surging glaciers are doing something far more dangerous. They are moving, blocking rivers, damming valleys, creating lakes that didn't exist a decade ago, above communities that have no evacuation plan and no warning system. The research team conducted the first comprehensive global analysis of surging glaciers ever attempted. Here is what they found. 3,100 surging glaciers. 1% of all glaciers on Earth. But that 1% covers nearly 20% of total glacier area on the planet, meaning these are among the largest glaciers that exist. And when a large glacier surges, the consequences downstream are not proportional to its size. They are exponentially larger. A surging glacier does 4 things that can kill people far from the glacier itself. It blocks rivers, damming them until the pressure builds and the dam fails catastrophically. It traps meltwater in the valleys it carves, creating glacial lakes that grow until their natural ice dams collapse. It detaches suddenly from its own slopes, sending walls of ice and rock cascading into the valleys below. And it develops crevasses, deep, unstable fractures across its surface, that make the glacier an active hazard for anyone near it. Each of those 4 failure modes produces what scientists call a GLOF, a glacial lake outburst flood. And a GLOF is not a flood in any sense that most people in North America would recognize. It is not water rising gradually from heavy rainfall. It is not a river swelling over several days as snowpack melts. A GLOF is the release of an entire lake, sometimes containing billions of gallons of water, in hours. When the dam holding that lake in place fails, the water doesn't rise. It explodes outward, carrying debris, ice, rock, and sediment, moving at speeds that can exceed 30 kilometers per hour through narrow mountain valleys. By the time anyone downstream hears it coming, there is nowhere to go. One glacial outburst flood in British Columbia generated a tsunami of water 330 feet high. Nobody was killed because nobody lived there. In the Peruvian Andes, a single glacial lake collapse killed between 1,800 and 6,000 people in a single afternoon. A single lake, a single failed ice dam, an entire city downstream gone. The current frequency of glacial lake outburst floods in the Himalayas is nearly 5 times higher than it was before the middle of the last century. Not twice, 5 times. The number of glacial lakes worldwide has grown by 22% in just 30 years. There are now 110,000 glacial lakes on the planet. Every single one of them is held in place by a dam of ice or compressed debris that is, right now, thawing. And here is where this stops being a story about distant mountains. 800,000 people in the Pacific Northwest of the United States live within the exposure zone of potential glacial lake outburst floods. Not in Pakistan, not in Nepal, in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And Alaska's exposure is even more immediate. The event that just declared a federal disaster in Juneau is not an anomaly. It is part of a pattern that has been intensifying year after year in the same location, from the same glacial lake, filling every summer and releasing every fall, with each drainage event larger than the one before. The barriers held this time. They may not hold next time. And the next time is already building above the city right now. Before we get to what this means for the United States, you need to understand what a surging glacier has already done to a country that has been living with this hazard longer than almost anyone else. Pakistan has more glaciers than any country outside the polar regions. More than 7,000. It also has more than 3,000 glacial lakes, and 30 of those lakes have been officially identified as posing imminent flood threats right now. When the Shisper Glacier in the Hun Valley surged and blocked a river, it created a lake that grew to dangerous size within weeks. When the ice dam failed, the outburst flood destroyed bridges, knocked out a power plant, damaged the Karakoram Highway, one of the most strategically important roads in South Asia, and cut off entire communities from road access. The repair bill ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. That was one glacier, one surge, one lake. Pakistan has 29 more lakes in the same category right now, today. The United Nations has documented more than 9,000 deaths from glacial lake outburst floods in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region alone. 9,000 people killed by water that came from a lake that didn't exist a generation ago, held behind a dam of ice that nobody built and nobody maintains. failing without warning in valleys where the river is the only road. What makes Pakistan's situation so important to understand is not just the scale of the deaths. It is the speed of the failure. Engineers studying the Shishpur outburst describe the transition from warning signs to full breach as happening in a window too short for meaningful downstream response. Monitoring stations registered the pressure building inside the ice dam. Scientists issued alerts, and the water still reached communities before people could fully evacuate, not because the warnings were wrong, but because the valleys are narrow, the rivers run fast, and the time between a dam failing and a wall of debris-laden water arriving at a village downstream can be measured in minutes rather than hours. That physics does not change when you move Glacier from Pakistan to Alaska, or from Alaska to Washington state. The mountain valley doesn't care what country it's in. The water moves at the same speed, the warning time is the same, and the road out of Ording, Washington, is no wider than the road out of a village in the Hunza Valley, and in the Cascade Range, and in every glaciated mountain system above a populated valley in the western United States. Here's the mechanism that makes this worse than almost anyone is saying publicly. Warming doesn't just melt glaciers. It changes what glaciers do before they melt. As the ice at the base of a glacier warms, meltwater can accumulate underneath it, lubricating the rock below. That lubrication is what drives a surge. The glacier that was locked in place by friction between ice and bedrock suddenly has a layer of pressurized water beneath it, and it moves violently suddenly in ways that no satellite predicted and no downstream community was prepared for. Think about what that means physically. A glacier that weighs billions of tons, frozen in place against a mountainside for centuries, suddenly loses its grip on the rock underneath it. The entire mass starts moving, not slowly, not gradually, all at once, accelerating down the valley, pushing everything in its path, rock, debris, the river that was flowing beneath it, into whatever sits downstream. The surge itself can be catastrophic, but the surge is often not the worst part. The worst part is what the surge leaves behind. When a surging glacier advances into a river valley, it acts as a dam. The river backs up behind the advancing ice. A lake forms, can fill in days or weeks, and then the ice dam that created it, freshly deposited, structurally unstable, made of compressed debris and poorly bonded ice, begins to leak. And then it fails. The glaciers that seem most stable, the large cold ones that haven't moved in centuries, are in some cases the most dangerous when they finally cross that threshold, because they contain more ice, more water, more stored energy, and when they move all at once. The study found that climate change is not simply making existing surging glaciers surge more often. It is creating new surging glaciers in regions where the phenomenon has never been recorded. Glaciers that were frozen solid from surface to bedrock, thermally cold all the way through, are now warming from the outside in. When the base of one of these glaciers reaches the melting point for the first time in its history, it can surge without any historical warning that it was capable of doing so. The map scientists used to identify high-risk glaciers are already out of date. Glaciers considered safe because they have never surged in the observational record are now capable of surging for the first time. And nobody knows which ones, or when, because the data required to make that prediction doesn't fully exist yet. In Central Asia, researchers studying some of the most stable glaciers in the world, glaciers in mountain ranges so cold that scientists had assumed they were resilient to warming, are now watching them destabilize. Snowfall shortages are cutting off their replenishment. Temperature thresholds that were crossed somewhere in the last decade are changing the physical dynamics inside ice masses that have been frozen in place for thousands of years. Scientists who have spent careers studying these specific glaciers are describing what they're seeing as something completely new. This is the thing that should make you stop, not the glaciers that are retreating. Scientists have been tracking those for decades. It's the glaciers that are accelerating. The ones that don't disappear quietly into meltwater but instead surge forward, block rivers, trap lakes, and then fail catastrophically without warning, sending billions of gallons of water down into valleys that have no idea what's coming. Washington State's Cascade Range contains active glaciers on Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, and Glacier Peak, all sitting above river valleys that drain into densely populated lowlands. Mount Rainier specifically is considered by geologists to be one of the most dangerous mountains in North America, not because of volcanic risk alone, but because the combination of glacial ice and steep river valleys creates the conditions for outbursts that could reach the communities below within hours. The city of Ording sits downstream. The USGS has modeled the evacuation timeline. From the moment an outburst begins, the people of Ording have approximately 30 to 40 minutes to get out. Ording has one road out. That is not a hypothetical. That is a documented hazard, a named community, named road, and a countdown that starts the moment the ice gives way. The water is already up there. The lakes are already filling, and the ice dams holding them in place are made of the same material that has been disappearing from mountain ranges around the world for decades. Faster every year, in places where nobody installed a gauge, nobody built a barrier, and nobody told the people living in the valley below what is sitting above them. The study calls for improved monitoring, better forecasting, adaptation planning in communities downstream. Most of those communities have not been told they are downstream, and that gap between what scientists know and what the people living in those valleys have been told is the most dangerous thing in this entire story. Not the ice, Not the water, the silence. Barriers in Juneau held because someone installed them in time. Because someone was watching. Because someone had a stream gauge on the river and a forecast model running and enough lead time to call the evacuation before the water arrived. Most of the 3,100 glaciers in this study have none of those things. No gauge, no model, no barrier, no one watching. Lakes that have been filling for years above communities that have never heard the term glacial lake outburst flood. In valleys where the river is the only road and the road goes underwater before the sirens ever sound. The water is already up there, right now, above Juneau, above Ording, above every valley in the western United States that sits downstream from a glacier that is warmer today than it was last year, and warmer last year than it was the year before. The ice dams holding those lakes in place are thinning every season. Some of them will fail this year. Some will fail next year. Some have already crossed the threshold and scientists don't know it yet because the monitoring station that would tell them doesn't exist. This is what 3,100 certain glaciers looks like from the ground. Not a chart, not a projection. A river that breaks its own record. A city that declares a federal disaster. A valley with one road out and 30 minutes to use it. The lakes are filling, the dams are thinning, and most of the people downstream are still waiting to be told.